Good evening, this is James Robert Deal. Today is July the 26th, 2016. I suppose you know I'm running for governor. And one of the things I want to talk about tonight is what's going on over at Hanford. We have not only the Hanford contamination from the production of plutonium during World War II and thereafter, but we also have a nuclear power plant over there called the Columbia Generating Station. So I want to talk about both of those. But first I want to encourage all of you who are listening to this program live and those who listen to playbacks to forward this information to your friends and encourage them to vote for me, to listen to these radio programs, and I hope to hit that donate button. And the amount that can be contributed is anywhere between $1 and $2,000. So probably the best link to forward to them is the jamesrobertdeal.org/radio link, because it has a link to this program and to everything else. You can go to jamesrobertdeal.org/platform and actually print off my flyers, or you can send a PDF of my flyers to other people. Now, the mudslide at Oso was a great tragedy, and I don't remember the exact number of people who died there. I think it was under 100, maybe under 50, and the state of Washington is being sued for millions of dollars to settle that. So there's a lot of hand-wringing over whether it could have been prevented and how to prevent such disasters in the future. But are we paying proper attention to such risks? Well, I maintain that oil trains are a much greater risk than what happened at Oso, and an oil train could catch fire and explode in a major city or even a small city and kill thousands of people. I think there were 57 people killed in Lac-Mégantic, if I'm pronouncing the French correctly, in Quebec several years ago. So that would be Oso times 1,000, or maybe 10,000. But what would happen if the Columbia Generating Station were to suffer an accident? You could have Oso times 10 million or 10 billion. The page to go to on my website is jamesrobertdeal.org/close Hanford Nuke. Close-Hanford-Nuke. You can read along or just listen to me, and I'll try to summarize. If I were so fortunate as to become your governor, I would do everything possible to close the Columbia Generating Station in Richland, and to do so as quickly as possible. The history of that station is that in the 1970s it was predicted that we were going to need a lot more electrical power, and so we set about to build 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I don't know how many nuclear power plants. The one at Hanford is the only one that was completed. There was one down at Longview which was partially constructed and was never completed. And this program was then called the Washington Power Supply System, or WHOOPS, WPPS. They've now changed their name and they call themselves Energy Northwest. So the Columbia Generating Station is owned by all of the PUDs in the state. I don't know if the private electric companies, such as Puget Sound Energy, which supplies electricity on the east side of Lake Washington in Bellevue, is a part owner. But I know that all the PUDs are part owners, and yes, I see in my notes here there were to be 5 nuclear power plants. So WHOOPS went through bankruptcy. Nuclear power is a bankrupt idea from the start. If you look at the amount of electricity that can be produced, and then you consider the cost of building one of these things, and then you consider the fact that it's going to need to be decommissioned, and then the federal government is going to safeguard the waste for a 250,000 years, maybe longer. There's no way that that pays off economically. So from the moment these nuclear power plants are built, they are money losers. They are bankrupt. The Columbia Generating Station is substantially the same General Electric model as the 3 Fukushima reactors, which melted down and exploded in 2011. Slightly different model, but all the same risks, all the same bad design, and it is an accident waiting to happen. The Columbia Generating Station is situated in an area that has frequent wildfires, and sometimes they're so bad that access to the Columbia Generating Station has to be blocked off. Now, my dear wife and I took a trip to Eastern Washington, and we drove over there. We were driving towards Richland, and from 20, 30 miles away, we could see this plume of steam rising from the nuclear plant. I should have a picture of that on my webpage here. It's pretty awesome that you can see it that far away. So as you get closer, the rising steam cloud gets larger and larger. And as you drive up to the power plant, the plume of steam rising into the air is enormous. And the other thing that's enormous is the noise. It is very noisy. Now, the generating station is located near the Grand Coulee Dam, and there's an earthquake epicenter near Grand Coulee. Grand Coulee was hit by a 7.4 on the Richter scale earthquake in 1972. So the Grand Coulee Dam is well built, but it could fail, and if it did, it would flood the nuclear power plant. It would short out the electrical facility, which burns diesel. First of all, the reactor would be shut down, but it's still hot, so it has to be cooled. So water has to be pumped through it. So you need auxiliary power, which is supplied by diesel generators that are part of every nuclear power plant. Well, those can be flooded and become inoperable, in which case the reactor would go critical, and the plutonium and the uranium would catch on fire, and they would burn, and they could burn for 100 years, polluting the entire country. Now, there are earthen dams upstream from the Grand Coulee, and if there were an earthquake, they could collapse, and that could trigger a collapse of the Grand Coulee Dam, and again flooding of the Columbia generating station. The Columbia generating station is located close to the Hanford site, where there were former nuclear power plants which didn't really produce electricity, they just made plutonium to go into bombs. But there's an enormous amount of radioactive waste there, and it has to be constantly maintained. So if the reactor went critical, then the workers would not be able to access the radioactive waste at Hanford. Conversely, if one of the storage tanks at Hanford exploded and released radioactivity, then the workers would not be able to access the Columbia generating station and all of its spent fuel pools. So if either happened, we would face a catastrophe at both. You never hear about it in the news. You never read about it in the newspapers. But nuclear power plants emit large quantities of radioactive tritium water every day. So these nuclear power plants take in thousands and thousands of gallons of water. Follow the links on this page, Close Hanford Nuke. You'll read that there are maybe 20,000 gallons per minute. Let me switch pages here. A typical 1,000 megawatt reactor with a cooling tower takes in about 20,000 gallons of water per minute for cooling, circulates it through the power plant, and then returns around 5,000 gallons of it per minute to the Columbia River. And the 15,000 gallons of water per minute goes up through the cooling tower, which is able to recover about 1/4 of the water taken in, and the 15,000 gallons per minute goes up in that steam cloud above the nuclear plant. That steam contains tritium, which is water with an extra electron. So it's radioactive. And some of that drains into the ground and becomes part of the groundwater, and then becomes part of the river. What you also don't read about in the newspaper is that there are radioactive gases which build up inside the nuclear plant, because this 50 miles of piping has valves that can leak. So radioactive gases such as cesium, krypton, xenon, all which have very long half-lives, build up inside the building where people work. And so as a safety measure to them, these gases are vented. Now sometimes the venting occurs occasionally, every few days, because the radioactivity becomes such a risk that it's unhealthy for the workers. Now, people say, oh, if I want to go take a tour, can I take a tour of the Columbia Generating Station? Actually, you can. You have to make an appointment. But I recommend that you don't go over there because the whole area is contaminated. If you did want to go over there, you'd want to take a throwaway set of clothes and booties to put on your feet. And then when you leave and want to get back in your car, carefully take these off, put them in a sealed bag, and when you get back, dispose of them as hazardous waste. You'll probably just be able to put them in the garbage. It is said that nuclear power is a good thing because it's carbon free. It doesn't burn fossil fuels. But that overlooks the fact that it takes enormous amounts of fossil fuel to mine, process, and refine the uranium. So then it takes more fossil fuels to provide the backup power to circulate water in the reactor and in the spent fuel pools when the plant is shut down, which happens from time to time. These plants are sometimes shut down for months at a time. You have to say that a nuclear power plant is an absurd way to boil water. I will also upgrade this particular website to include a reference to the cancer clusters. There are three counties which surround Hanford and the Columbia Generating Station all have cancer clusters. Now, this is part of the timid media approach to such things, that you don't read about it very much. You do read about the cancer clusters, but there's no suggestion that it's vapors coming from Hanford waste or possibly the radioactive gases emitted by the Columbia Generating Station, which are causing the cancer. So recently there's been suggestions that folate be added to the diet, because that is something that is done when someone is exposed to nuclear radiation. Hanford, I'm sorry to say, is apparently a permanent dead zone. So when we talk about cleaning it up, we're talking about an astronomical cost. There's so much plutonium and other waste in unprotected storage, just sitting at the active nuclear power plants. There are 103 of them in the United States, maybe 102, because I think that the last nuclear power plant in California, the last two, have been shut down. The one at San Diego was shut down, and there's one a little further north, which is shut down or is being shut down. So what's going to be done with that toxic waste, radioactive toxic waste? Some miracles of transformation are going to have to take place, and then it's going to have to be transported. And that's not being done. At closed nuclear power plants, such as the one at San Onofre near San Diego. They planned to start moving the nuclear waste to Carlsbad. Carlsbad is in New Mexico, and it's in the very north, the very southeast corner of New Mexico, right up against Texas. And we don't have a nuclear repository for non-military nuclear waste, but we do have a repository for the military waste that comes out of submarines and other military uses. So that's where the military puts their nuclear waste. So there was a plan to start moving the nuclear waste from San Onofre that had cooled down and deposited it in the federal repository at Carlsbad. And then there were objections to transporting it because it was too risky to transport. So that plan was shelved, and now the nuclear waste is sitting in permanent, semi-permanent, maybe permanent forever storage at San Onofre. And so San Onofre is going to be a dead zone, apparently, for the next 250,000 years. Now, we don't have a 250,000 years because, thanks to our fossil fuel usage, the sea levels are going to rise, and they could rise a lot. And nuclear power plants need a lot of water to operate. So they tend to be found, they're always found, on shorelines close to sea level or on rivers close to the river level. There's a nuclear power plant just north of Omaha. It's on the Missouri River, and it claimed close to flooding. And now we're having more erratic weather. You could have bigger flood, and they actually kept that plant from flooding by sandbagging around it. At the end of World War II, we had all these nuclear engineers now who needed jobs, and so the Eisenhower administration invented atoms for peace and encouraged nations around the world to build nuclear power plants. And one of the nations which did that was Iran. Got into the nuclear power business. So now we're paying the price. Other calamities could happen. The Earth could be hit with a coronal mass ejection, the size of the Carrington event, which happened in 1859. We're going to take a short break. I'm going to come back, and we're going to continue with this interesting topic. And I'll check my emails. I have some music in the meantime.
Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Do unto our Mother Earth as you would have her return to you. Do unto others applies for our descendants, those billions yet unborn. daughters for the next 10,000 years. Do unto others applies for all. Hey, Mr. Rich Guy, I'm talking to you. Hey, big company, I'm talking to you too. Hey, big government, I'm talking to you too. Do unto others applies to all. Hey, Monsanto, where's your code? Your code of ethics, you should have one. You fraudulent seller of carcinogenic Roundup. Monsanto, where's your code? Profits must be.
So I'm back. Now, I'm not the greatest singer in the world, and that's not a very good recording, but I think it's a very good song. It at least enabled me to express myself and my frustrations. So we could have a mass ejection that would wipe out our electrical grid, so there would not be electricity, which would power the backup generators, and sooner or later we'd run out of diesel and they'd catch fire. So it's just a very dumb way to boil water. So what's my view of global warming and burning fossil fuels? I would say that we should just stop drilling. Stop drilling for new oil, stop drilling for gas. There would still be continuing production. It would gradually decline. And in my song, one of the lines is, Shell Oil, how much did you spend drilling in the Chukchi Sea? $8 billion? $8 billion could buy enough solar generation to power 230,000 homes. So Shell wasted all that money. They could have had a solar production, which would replace their fossil fuel. So stop drilling. That's the solution. Of course, a governor doesn't necessarily have power over such things, but could favor an energy supplier for state vehicles, state gas. Favor those companies which are doing the most to stop drilling and to put new capital into renewables such as solar, wind, wave, tide, geothermal. So if you're ever invited to tour the Columbia Generating Station, my suggestion is don't go. Another thing that I feel strongly about is that Washington should take a greater part in locating a permanent repository for nuclear waste. There was a huge ruckus over transporting nuclear waste from San Diego across California, and then across Nevada to New Mexico. And so it wasn't done. Why do you think, let's say if the repository in Nevada that was proposed, why do you think that Nevada would be interested in receiving nuclear waste from Washington? Washington has more than half of all the dangerous nuclear waste in the country. A repository, there should be a repository in Washington, and research should go into locating a site that is geologically stable, meaning it's unlikely to be subject to a quake, an earthquake, which would cause it to leak, and unlikely to have water flowing through it. And the problem with the proposed repository in Nevada is that it would be under a mountain which has water that leaks in at the top and flows through it. So some people say it was just cheap politics that resulted in the cancellation of that plan, but actually it made scientific sense. So let's think long term. Let's think long term about climate change. Let's think short term about climate change. Let's think long term about the nuclear power plants that are capable of poisoning the whole region. Let's think long term about our transportation plan. I've enjoyed talking to you about this, and I hope to hear from you. Let's see if my connection here to my email is open. I'm looking for any emails on the subject of the nuclear power plant, but everybody is writing about different things. So let's just leave that subject and answer some of these questions. So I have a question here about smart meters and what's so bad about them. And what's so bad about them is that they're defective from the start, they catch fire, they're cheaply built, they're installed by non-electricians. I hope that background noise is not coming through. So I'm going to terminate this and say it's been a pleasure dealing with you. I don't know where that is coming from. So thank you for attending this session, and I look forward to talking to you again. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.